So we have just over half an hour for questions, and please raise your hand and get a microphone and ask away. Yes, please, microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is to Vitaly Chernetsky. Thank you very much for your presentation and the invitation to the audience to take the task of trying to make sense of these fragmented and difficult narratives, which I think is an important task for us all to embrace. The question is kind of about Szkoła Numer 3, but not only. It's sort of the wider attempts of cinema, but cultural products more generally in Ukraine now to sort of represent the unrepresentable, or what seems to be the unrepresentable. If I remember correctly, only 2 of the monologues that we hear from the young people address the war sort of directly, one about the shelling of the house and the other one about the boyfriend who joins the separatists. And even those monologues are about relationships, one with a mother and the other one with a boyfriend. And the others kind of talk around the war, but they actually don't talk about the war. And yet the war is absolutely everywhere. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't take the center stage, unlike in Cyborgs, for instance, right? And that happens, like the films I can think of is Bondarchuk's Volcano and Ukrainsky Sheriff, Ukrainian Sheriffs. 2 very different films as well, where it's the kind of similar approach. We're aware of the war all the time, but it's not being explained to us at all. So the question I am asking is, where does this language around the war, as opposed to about the war, fit into the attempts to represent the war in Donbas now? And whether it's important that it's still ongoing, and that's why it's the method that some people take.
Thank you so much for this really thought-provoking and important question, because I think you nailed the central issue there. The filmmakers were trying, I think, focus not so much on representing the war, but representing the human experience of survivors, and encouraging them to tell their story, developing, the whole technique of documentary theater to let people tell their stories, develop this kind of interview. And this, some people would say that this is similar to, say, what Svetlana Alexievich does in her fiction, but she then structures it into her narrative and adds her authorship on it. And here, we do not pull away from that. We still get the stories of these young people. And the war is more visible in the couple of cases, as you correctly pointed out. To me, it's slightly more visible in others. Yes, the young woman who is partly of Kazakh origin and her story of escaping to Aterau. And there is, even when they talk about leaving, they mention, for example, that there is one family member who is staying and how they're trying to get out, and they're not sure how they're trying to get out there. They can tell about what they experienced. These are high school kids, and they were not at the front line. They did not hold any guns in their hands, and and several of them do mention, and we see these young boys who do not look in any ways as threatening and militant. But we are aware of the practice of recruiting child soldiers in a lot of conflicts around the world. So hearing their perspective is, in fact, very, very important. I would say that this was a voice and a perspective that was often lacking in most cultural representations of conflicts, or it comes very much afterwards, like interviewing the survivors of Rwandan genocide, for example, and things of that kind. So we have this paradoxical situation in that the war is not over, but having become this sort of semi-frozen conflict where there is still shelling and there are still people dying almost every day. Nevertheless, there is a semi-normalcy, or at least a semblance of semi-normalcy in areas that are just a few kilometers from the front line. And this allows for cultural engagement and also understanding. I think a lot of elements that are important here is in some ways the sense of guilt that some members of the Ukrainian intellectual elite have about neglecting people from that area. And this is not the stereotypical "почути Donbas," or in Russian "услышать Donbas," but to find out the experiences of these young people and to establish those meaningful connections. One of the stories there is this young kid who has this crush on this volunteer, Halia, and he's about to have a Skype call with Halia, and Halia is so wonderful, but she's far away. She's not even in Kiev, she is somewhere in Europe, further west. I forget which country she is at the moment. But we see his excitement. He's all in anticipation of the Skype call, and then the Skype call happens. And this is the window that their lives are meaningful and matter for this bigger world outside. And that is a very important message. So we do not have the Neville Chamberlain, a faraway conflict in a country about which we know nothing, that we do not have this attitude in the world, trying to prevent that. That's how I would argue.
Yes, Roman, and introduce yourself, I guess, for this, because we are filming this.
Thank you. Roman Ivashkiv, UIUC. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. When I'm listening to you talk about cinema, I develop a pang of discipline envy. So I want to do cinema too. I have a question for Yuri. Thank you for your very insightful juxtaposition of the two films, Cyborgs and Atlantis. I'm interested in the trope of, or in the symbolic act, rather, of shooting at the imperial or colonizer symbols. Which you showed us a little excerpt of that in the film. I was immediately reminded of Yuri Andruchovich's Moscoviade, where this takes place as well. And more recently and interestingly in the Russian film by Andrei Zvyagintsev, Leviathan, when they go to shoot, when Nikolai is asked by one of the police officers, his friend, to go and shoot. Can you elaborate on that? Because on the one hand, it has this cleansing effect, albeit it's also a very violent image. Thank you.
I can address that from a very extended interview I had, like an hour-long interview I had with Valentin Vasyanovich, and that is his intention, that this scene opens the film. There are no explanations or anything, but then you are left with that scene and how to interpret it. Later on, both are deeply scarred by the war. Both characters are deeply scarred by the war. One of them, to such an extent that he cannot accept his new self and commit suicide. So that kind of the attempt to cleanse oneself of the scars of the war is fraught with death. Another one is quickly degenerating, following the same trajectory to the point when he accidentally encounters a woman who is an archaeologist and who thinks she's very lucky in her life because she is one of the very few who gets to practice her intended profession, with that difference that she unearths things not 1,000 years after the events, but 2 or 3 or 5 years after they happened. And this woman introduces order, sense, and meaning into the life of Serhiy, who is the protagonist, and literally saves him. But also, in an act of doing that, there is a fantastic scene when they make love in a van that ferries dead bodies from the sites of their burial, and we don't see what's going on until the camera kind of moves or zooms on them, and they are naked making love, and then we realize that there are dead bodies in body bags on the shelves on both sides of them. And strangely enough, this is a kind of apotheosis of indestructibility of humanity, of a kind of this Italian film director took it as a scene of human rebirth.
This is very interesting that you mentioned archaeology, because in Andryczyk's volcano, there's also this digging, or they're looking for, like, with a metal detector for things like, for the German points or something, or remnants. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, Maria, and then.
Just a quick question. Is it going to be clear to viewers of the film Atlantis why it's titled Atlantis? Or have you asked the director about that?
I have, and I know about the project when it was 85% conceived. The way it was conceived initially was like 85, if not 90% different from what it eventually came to be. And at that point already it was Atlantis, and when there was pitching, he was pitching that project at Odessa Film Festival. He didn't know that Atlantis in English was, Atlantida in English was Atlantis, so he would try to speak English and say Atlantida and Atlantida, and international members of the pitching committee didn't know what the hell he was talking about. So the metaphor, and I shouted at him, it's Atlantis. So the metaphor was lost, the metaphor of the continent and the culture that is drowned and lost was lost on the pitching members committee. The intended meaning was for it to be a film about the lost industrial Donbas, the Donbas that is forever lost. There is a scene when an American environmentalist, a woman, is explaining to the author, to the protagonist, that the environmental catastrophe wreaked by the occupation is so bad that this area is unlivable, is left unlivable for thousands of years, because the underground waters have been irreparably contaminated. There's no way for people to live here and engage in economic. But he also means, in a metaphorical sense, not only the industries, but the kind of the world that was connected with Donbas. So I think it's up to the viewer, and the film is not for mass consumption. It's deliberately and kind of programmatically for people who like to wreck their brains and kind of play with imagery and
My name is Olga Karpenkina. I'm not an academic. I work in contemporary art. I'm a curator. So that's my question, because we're dealing a lot in the United States. We're dealing a lot with the consequences of deindustrialization, and we have a lot of lost cities, like Pittsburgh. Maybe not Pittsburgh, but the suburbs, which had this glorious steel industries and also minor, coal industries. So, and they're lost. Detroit, right? So it's and there wasn't war. There was no war here, but it's a capitalism which actually causes these destructions. So it's just a comment.
Thank you. A good question. I am inclined to interpret the film not quite so literally as you seem to be interpreting it. It's about the loss of a particular way of thinking, of a particular mode of life, of a particular way of relating to oneself, one's history, and the others. I would even go farther and say that I'm inclined to interpret Atlantis as the lost, drowned continent of Sovietness and colonial legacy. But again, this is my subjective interpretation. And
Irina had a question, and then.
My question is for Pan Yuri as well. Thanks a lot for the insightful talk. My question deals with this colonial, post-colonial optics that you're applying to compare the two films. So it seems that your analysis, your comparison works on the two levels. So one is, let's call it stylistical. So how does the film do post-colonial or colonial narrative? And then the other level would be the kind of reality it depicts. Is that colonial reality or post-colonial reality? And it seems that Atlantis deals with this decolonized fictional space, whereas the cyborgs depict the space which is still very much post-colonial, if not colonial. So my question would be, is when we depict the space which is post-colonial, which Ukraine is, so the space which still very much bears this mark of being dependent on the colonizers' narratives, etc., by depicting that space accurately, so sort of not doing what Atlantis does, not stripping off that narrative of colonization, do we sort of fall prey to the colonizer by just accurately depicting the mark it left? Or, you know, it's almost balancing between the two expectations that we often have for cinema. One is to report, and the other one is to sort of create the ideal alternative narrative, the world we would be looking up to. So what do you think? How accurately does this depiction have to happen in order not to become the reaffirmation of the colonizer's narrative? I hope it made sense.
A lot of
was
sense.
a question. Thank you.
Thank you for the question that I would love to ask myself. I think the two films very nicely fall under the interpretation of anti-colonial and post-colonial that is laid out by Marko Pavlishin in his very early, but very, I think, very enlightening and illuminating publication about the colonial features of Ukrainian literature in the early 90s. And there he does write about that, the fact that anti-colonial, in its protest against the colonizer, is forever locked with the colonizer in this endless dance, following the melody, the tunes, and the rules set out by the colonizer. And that is, by default, a self-defeating posture. The trick is to become post-colonial, to render the colonizer irrelevant, to kind of evaporate the coordinates set by the colonizer as not applying to you any longer. In that sense, for instance, do you get to say that the Crimean Tatars were not collaborators, as you are probably tempted to do if you were Artem Seitablayev, because supposedly Haytarma doesn't mention about the collaborationism. And then you are reactive. You react always. Do you say that there was the 1 million strong Русская освободительная армия, ROA, by Vlasov, General Vlasov, forever talking, responding to another and another and another cue sent by the colonizer? Or do you pretend that the colonizer doesn't exist and don't even respond to that? I think the answer is obvious. And in that sense, Cyborg is locked. It's reactive. It talks with the colonizer, and in the final analysis, it is unsuccessful. It's self-defeating. Whereas reproducing reality, real filmmaking as art to me is Dovzhenko and is Valentin Vasyanovich, because they are not about reflecting reality and being locked in this circular argument. Oh, you cannot show Ukraine that is all Ukrainian speaking because that's not reality. First you do that, and then you are expected to reflect what has been done to the country. And so there's no exiting that. Dovzhenko, I'm sure, created his films in a situation 100 times more saturated with Russian influences. Yet he found in himself, a sense of necessity and obligation and duty to create his own reality, which still astounds us with its very similitude. To me, that's the real cinematographic art. And I think Vasyanovich is strongly within that. And I think that's the kind of filmmaking that we should be encouraging and celebrating.
But do you think we might be losing some stories and we might be losing some voices which have been shaped in a sense very strongly sometimes by that colonial heritage if we just simply say, you know, we should focus on that kind of pure...
Absolutely. I agree with that, but don't forget that we have documentary filmmaking, and that might take care of those stories. Because documentary filmmaking, it can be argued, is primarily about reflecting reality with its real life stories and stuff. But we are in fictional filmmaking, particularly in the time of war. The war that we don't realize, we are distracted by military war from the war where Russians are winning. And the election of the president, of the television president, is, in my opinion, a strong argument to that point, that Ukrainians are so divided in their heads by the propaganda, Russian propaganda, that it broadcast by Ukrainian oligarchic-owned media, because nobody resists them. Vasyanovich is one of the few people who does, and there are some others, but they are on the margins still, and so it's imperative for Ukrainian culture and Ukraine as a civilization, if it were to survive, to kind of develop the kind of filmmaking that Dovzhenko and Vasyanovich and a few others represent.
Okay, we have a question here. Yes, please.
It's
And please,
Miss
please identify yourself, please.
Andrew Grigorenko. It's to Ms. Zubkovych. I don't know if it was intentional or not, because when you introduced the Crimean Tatar filmmaking, you mentioned translation of word Haytarma, but actually somehow you did not mention that Haytarma, it is a national melody, national song, national dance. And it actually was created before the communism. And it's also refer to early deportation, because it's Crimea and population was deported several times. And the first deportation, by the way, it was Crimean Tatar-speaking Christians. And they were deported into Russia and actually assimilated and disappeared as a specific group. And on the other hand, you also did not mention, regardless that it was in your quotation, was said the Crimean Tatars, in parentheses, it was said Kremls. Because it is more proper name for the Crimean Tatars, because again, probably it should be mentioned that under Tsar, Tatars were used for different ethnic group. It was Kazan Tatars, Astrakhan Tatars, Crimean Tatars, and Caucasian Tatars, who now known as Azeri, by the way. That's the question.
Would you like to respond?
Thank you very much for your comment. I think I have mentioned that is the name of the dance and of the song, and it is translated as return. But okay, maybe it was.
It's very symbolic.
Yeah, of course. But as for Kermeli, also it is mentioned there because it was the quotation, and it's important to name it the way how people name it. So yeah, it is there. As for the other deportations, I mean, if I had more time, I would explain, I will go into details what is happening with the political imprisonment in Crimea, what are the context of deportation as such, what are the context of the pre-deportation era, or how some of the historians interpret the three waves of deportation, starting with the Russian Empire and so on. But of course, not having that much time and having only the possibility to talk about the current film production, cinematic representation. Of course, there are a lot of them that I haven't spoken about. Thank you very much for. Yeah.
But on the first not deportation, but first annexation of Crimea by Russian Empire, there was about 10 million Crimean Tatars in Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's less than half a million.
Yes. We had a. Did you still have a question or? Yes. Okay, you were next then. Oh, Oksana. And then
Oksana.
in the back.
So I originally thought of this as a question for Pan Yuri, but I think I'm going to extend it to all of the presenters. And one of the issues, I guess I was very much bothered by the ideal realized in Atlantis. If your interpretation is correct, that it's somehow a basis for a stable Ukrainian identity, it's a very troubling type of identity that we get out of this. That's accomplished by this fantasy of purity, right? We achieve purity, but the cost of purity is something like a humanitarian and ecological catastrophe, but it's still somehow this satisfying thing to enjoy, as opposed to this bad movie, The Cyborgs, that is taking on board all of these narratives imposed on us by the aggressor and that implicate us in the dialectic of the colonial subjects. So instead of viewing these two as antagonistic, it would be, I think, useful to view the two projects as complementary. One is fulfilling, as Irina was suggesting, a descriptive function, and another is fulfilling a normative function. And then once you separate the real from the ideal in this way, you also can answer or raise more questions about the viability of the ideal. So is the Atlantis the right type of ideal for us to envision, on the basis of which to construct this alternative Ukrainian pure identity that ignores all of these Russian markers? And I guess a similar way the question could be extended to Tatar identity, right? To what extent it actually requires this purification and reconstruction, or trying to save the narrative instead of trying to acknowledge some of these instances of, say, collaboration, some of these instances of impurity as having indeed been part of the historical past that we also have to deal with and confront if we want to move forward somehow to articulate this new ideal on the basis of which to build our self-conception.
Thank you so much. I actually expected this question, and I'll try to be brief. I didn't use the word purity. You used it. I used the word free from colonial influence. That's not purity. Yuri Shevchuk, who taught at this university, famously writes that the colonizer is pure. The colonized, in the eyes of the colonizer, should always be hybridized. And that thinking is that kind of imbalance or imbalance of expectation is in itself colonialist. It's not about purity. It's about self-reliance, independence, and affirmation of who you are, not at the expense of anybody else. That's the perception of the colonizer. Assertion of one's own identity as aggression against colonizer. Why do you speak Ukrainian so demonstratively? Have you ever heard this spoken in the United States? Why do you speak English so demonstratively? Yet in Ukraine still you can hear that, because your simple assertion of who you are is perceived by the colonizer as aggression, as purity, as fascism. You know, purity is a code word for that, of course, and then you know where that leads. So it's a matter of reading, and I don't think Valentin Vasyanovich ever anywhere in this film meant purity to be read into the film. All he was trying to say is that here we are after the war. We are self-sufficient. We are trying to overcome this legacy, and there's a way to do that.
There was another question to Alina.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the question. I think that those films were the first steps into the articulation of the oppressed discourses, and therefore they very much were dependent on the taste of the film director and the way how he articulate the situation. And the last film, Evge, shows very much the shift, the switch from this very clear black and white vision of the past. And of course, clearly the mature discourse is important for our understanding of the past, because it's also somehow construct the future. And therefore, I hope that their homework would be the next step to think in the more complex way about the identities and about the complexities that we are facing today with the Ukrainian Crimean Tatar discourse. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, so probably last question right here. Yes, please. And introduce yourself.
Albert Rosenblatt, maybe for Yuri, but others can contribute. Have you seen the movie Man with a Stool?
Yes,
About
I showed it 2 weeks ago here.
Okay, well, I
With
missed
the-
your
with the
showing, but
director.
I showed it. I saw it.
We
in
missed you.
Razom showed it, and it's somewhat contradictory because the main theme of the film is these Ukrainians that go hitchhiking, or I don't know what they're traveling from Canada to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, and despite the differences in language and race and so forth, they're able to communicate with the Hispanics and with the Indians on a heart-to-heart basis. And they're using music and also they start with the children, relating to the children, and then the adults relate to them. And then at the end, they go back to Ukraine, and they're trying to create a ideal society in this village. And then there's a totally different film that comes in, which is that the filmmaker goes to the Donbas, and he completely surrenders to despair. So it's like a little bit of a contradiction. And I'm just wondering if what you made out of the film.
Well, number one, if you talk about the film is interesting in the sense that unintentionally or intentionally, it kind of deconstructs another of the imperial myths of Ukrainian identity as insular and provincial, because it shows Ukrainians completely at ease communicating with the rest of the world, lacking nothing in that communication, and doing it outside the Russian language that they taught to think of as the only possible channel of communication. And that's, again, I don't know if you know, but in Ukraine, under the Soviet occupation, it was forbidden to publish in Ukrainian translations of world literature before Russian translations were published first. It was frowned upon to borrow English words from English before they were borrowed into Russian or outside of Russian. I can continue going on and on. So in that sense, the film is also very post-colonial. The fact that he commits suicide, I also wanted you to know, because maybe you don't realize that, all people in the film, Ukrainian participants of the film, speak either Ukrainian, or one Belarusian speaks Russian, or sometimes Belarusian. He is forgiven for that matter. I'm joking. But Ukrainians speak not simply Ukrainian, it's very refined. The choice of words they make broadcasts loud and clear that for them it's a treasure. It's the thing that makes them inimitable, original, special and unique. And that message is broadcast very loud by that film. That he kills himself, I posed that question to the director who was in attendance there at Solovyov, Popov, I'm sorry. Solovyov was his assistant, Solovyova. And he said that there is a kind of counterintuitive note of optimism in his in the fact that he commits suicide. I don't know. I didn't feel it there, but all of the film was vibrating with life, and his those of you who haven't seen the film, he actually films himself committing suicide. The guy. So it was almost like a theatric, orchestrated, staged, horrible thing that you don't see the actual blowing off his brain or something, but he takes the AK and he speaks about having lost suddenly the reason to live. So I have no answer to that part of your question.
Okay, so we will conclude our panel here. I just want to make a few notes. Tomorrow we'll reconvene in this room at 11 o'clock, not at 1 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and then we'll have a lunch break, and then the second panel will begin at 2:30. And again, you're all invited to the exhibition opening by Vladko Kaufman, A Conversation at the Ukrainian Museum, which is at 222 East 6th Street in East Village. So you have time to get down there and grab a bite to eat somewhere around there. I'll invite you all down to the 12th floor to the heart of the Haytarma Institute for a reception. Everybody's invited. But first, let's thank our panelists for a riveting panel.